The time is 7:29 and the board is reconvened in open session. Do we have any items from closed session? Mr. Burdine.
Yes, ma'am, Madam President. I have a recommended board action on resignation and release agreement. I move that the board approve and authorize the superintendent to execute the resignation and release agreement between Fort Bend ISD and Kimberly Carroll, certified employee as presented, subject to approval by legal counsel.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Burdine and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed? The motion is unanimous. Thank you. Now I think we're ready to move on to our review items. Dr. Dupree, do we have a presentation for 6A?
Well, we actually have more of a conversation with the board this evening. Beth Martinez is joining us at the table, but I'm going to begin the dialogue because even today, there's been a lot of discussion amongst the staff, and I've talked to a few board members. I contacted all the board members today to let them know of my further reflection over the weekend about how to handle this process. What we're referring to, as you know, is the feeder pattern and boundary planning work that needs to take place in the district. I am personally very happy that we're at this place in our process. As you know, we began over a year ago with our facilities master planning process. We had a steering committee. We have thousands of people literally engaged in public participation and community dialogue meetings to help develop the facilities master plan. In April, the board approved that master plan, and one of the key aspects of that plan was that number one, that the board developed policy around feeder patterns, boundaries, and how we distribute programs in this district. The board spent many, many hours this summer working on that policy, and you adopted that policy in August. It's a very rigorous, very robust policy that provides exactly the guidance we need as an administrative team moving forward. So since the board's adoption of that policy in August, we have now, well, let me go back, because in May, the board also approved the contract with DeYoung and Richter to perform community engagement around future boundaries and feeder pattern studies. So we have the tools in place at this point. The only thing we needed was the adoption of that policy in August. You did that. And so now, since that adoption, we were able to then have the framework to begin our work. So since that board adoption, Beth and I have worked extensively with Tracy Richter, with DeYoung and Richter, to put together a timeline, most notably, and plans around doing the work for boundaries and feeder patterns. As you know, we were talking about the idea initially of one structure, of perhaps having a steering committee model like we did last year. But I realized as I looked more deeply into this, the key aspect when it comes to feeder patterns is really operating from a perspective of bringing the more localized citizens, the people who have a vested interest in the boundaries being drawn, to the table. So we have put together a plan, and I'm probably saying everything Beth wanted to say, but I'll let you talk in a minute. So what we've done is we've put together a plan whereby we want to hire Tracy Richter to do community engagement. But in this case, the administration will serve sort of as the steering committee and will work closely with Tracy in engaging the community in an active way to do the same level of community engagement, including the community dialogue meetings, the surveys, all of the work that we've become accustomed to in this district. But we believe what this does is it takes out that extra layer of kind of bureaucracy, that extra steering committee level that allows us to go directly to the community. And more importantly, it allows the administration to work more directly with the board through routine updates and workshop meetings to keep the board fully engaged in the process. And so I think we've got a very good solution that we're recommending to you tonight. Of course, we're very interested in your dialogue. That's why we're here this evening, because the plan is that we would then bring to you next Monday a proposal for approval so that we can begin work immediately in forming and beginning to start the feeder pattern and the boundary work. Beth has a draft timeline for you that we have it on the screen. It's kind of hard to read, but Beth, if you would kind of talk through the timeline, that would be great.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
As Dr. Dupree said, we are, the big picture is we're looking at feeder pattern alignment and engaging the community in that process, and the boundary process as well, planning forward primarily or initially for elementary school 46 and elementary school 47, as we know that are on the table, but then also being able to look at what other needs may be pressing in the district. And so with that kind of high-level overview of where we're headed, I want to give you just a broad scope before we look at the details of the timeline, broad scope for the feeder pattern process. And that is, as Dr. Dupree said, that community engagement piece. It is sharing with the community what the framework is, getting input from the community, coming back and doing some planning around developing options or draft options, sharing with the board, feedback from the board's perspective, and then going back out to the community for more input along the way. Very similar, in fact, replicating the process that we used during the facilities master planning process in terms of engaging the community and using the feedback from the community to then shape the options and the recommendations for the feeder pattern planning moving forward. And then the same process would be used in the boundary planning, a concurrent process, if you will, going through that feeder pattern alignment and our planning for feeder patterns and the boundary planning as well. Getting input from the community and then moving forward, sharing that community feedback during board meetings and board workshops, and then framing the options and the recommendations with that feedback from the community to then finalize recommendations for Dr. Dupree to provide for you and in your hopeful approval of those recommendations. And so that being said, the broad scope, if you'll kind of drill down into this timeline, which you can get your telescopes out and see the screen there, or you have one in front of you for review, I want to explain to you sort of the format of what we're looking at here. I said concurrent processes. You'll see the boundary planning at the top, and then on the bottom you have the feeder say this 3 times, it's really hard. Feeder planning, feeder pattern planning. I bet you can't do it. I practiced all day.
Is Sally selling seashells by the
That's right.
seashore?
That's right. And then the months spanning from September to May there, with the board workshops and meetings across the top of the month, so you can see where we're planning to have those checkpoints along the way. So let's begin with the feeder pattern planning process at the bottom. Beginning in October, the district administrative team that Dr. Dupree referred to would review our feeder pattern process and then go to the community during October to receive input on that framework from the community, a starting point, if you will, as we move forward in the feeder pattern work. And then in November, administrative team would be working to review the results of the community dialogue. So everything that we received from the questionnaire in those face-to-face meetings, and then putting those meetings online again in order to provide an opportunity for community members who may not be able to attend one of the sessions to provide that input online. So bringing all that data back to the administrative team to put it into an organized fashion that we can share back with the board. And then we'll move forward to January, where we'll use that input. The administrative team will use the input from the community to draft those options for the feeder pattern in a work session. And then work further through January and February, reviewing the options that we're working on. That would be the team, the administrative team, and then other members of the district staff that we would need in order to look at the geographic data that DeJong Richter would bring to the table. Where are the students living, and how do these options meet the needs of the students based on what you all have laid forward in policy. And then we would begin preparing for the community dialogue meetings regarding the district-wide feeder pattern. So that takes us into February, where we would go back to the community again for their input on the draft options for feeder patterns. And then once we get that information back in the face-to-face meetings and online methods of input from the community, we would then review that information and begin developing recommendations to come to the board with during an additional meeting, a work session. If you'll recall last year when we had that session at the administrative annex, where we kind of talked through those draft recommendations. And so that would be an opportunity in March to be able to talk through those draft recommendations, but throughout the entire process, bringing information forward on the options and recommendations through the workshop format and the board meetings. And then with the goal being for April to be the month that Dr. Dupree brings those recommendations to you on what the feeder patterns will look like in the district. So that's that overarching feeder pattern, taking us pretty much through the school year to get that defined.
Beth, let me interject a couple of things before you move on. I think it's important to note two things. One, it's important, we want to value the work that was done by the steering committee and our community prior. So there are aspects of the feeder pattern work that have been significantly addressed in the prior work. So we do want to resurrect that work, use that work as a starting point for our discussion. The other thing that's very important is, we realize we get to April, but I think even through all discussions about feeder pattern alignments, this is where you can really see how feeder patterns relate to boundaries. But the most important thing is we want to be able to come up with a solution for board approval that takes time to enact. So this is not something where we would come forth in April with a solution that's effective in August. So there might be some things effective a year out, some maybe 2 or 3 years out even, but we want to have a well-developed plan that would be implemented over time because we want to be mindful of students moving through the system. We want to be mindful of the communities where our community is growing, where it's not growing. So we want to be able to use our demographic data and all of our best work to develop a long-range implementation of whatever plans we put together too. Because I know that's one thing we've heard from the community. So with looking at an April timeline, I want to be very sensitive to the fact this isn't a recommendation in April that's announced and effective in August. We want to implement it over time.
Very good. Then moving to the top of the timeline, you have the boundary planning in the band in red. That would begin pending board approval of the work, where we would begin discussing the process that we will use and determining which schools might be impacted by the need for boundaries for that to go through that process. And again, we know 46 and 47 are on the table, but looking at other areas that may be pressing and building out that timeline.
Well, and again, Beth, that's where I think I'd want to point out that that's again where we would go back to the facilities master plan that's been adopted and carefully study, are there any of those where the schools are growing at such a rate we do need to do something very quickly. So we'd want to study all of that work along with our current enrollment trends and projections to see what else we might need to do. I think, as you would expect, boundary work takes extensive amounts of time, and so we don't expect we can do a district-wide study in months. That's going to take a while, but we do want to begin with the most critical work and then roll out everything else in kind of a, I don't know, triage is a word that comes to mind, but in a staged manner, very carefully over the coming couple of years.
And then once those areas are identified, we would target October to begin addressing those campuses that may be impacted by working with the principals to provide them communication, guidelines and communication around soliciting membership on their local school committees for those areas that will be impacted by boundaries. So, for example, elementary school 46 and 47, going out to those campuses that would be impacted by a boundary change and working with the principals to solicit to the community for folks to become engaged in that process at a local level, about a 7 to 10 member committee, following guidelines similar to what we have in place for our campus-based leadership teams, where you have we want to make sure that there is an open opportunity for everyone, that we're very tight in terms of the communication and expectations around membership, and that the membership is an example of the community or identifies with the community and represents the community. And so we would definitely work with the folks, the principals at the school, to identify the membership of that team following guidelines, but allowing principals that kind of tight loose, the ability to choose that the membership of that committee within those guidelines. And then we would, once those community committees in the community are identified, then our district administrative team would begin meeting together with those local communities in November to go over the options development for possible boundaries. The administrative team would take the information gathered from those local communities, compile that information, and use it to finalize boundary options, share with you as a board, and then as well bring those options to the table for that first community dialogue around the boundary process. So going out to those local communities, getting feedback from the community in the face-to-face meetings, and then again with that online option around the options that have been developed to address boundaries in those particular areas. That would take us through November and December, and at the same time in December, following the community dialogue sessions, the administrative team is going to plan on meeting with those local school communities in kind of a two-phase process where the local community committees would meet with the district administrators to go over the feedback from the options and begin to frame the recommendations to move forward with in a work session of creating those recommendations that ultimately, the following month, being the goal to provide the recommendations to you as a board for consideration in January for those identified areas back in September, October, as Dr. Dupree said, drawing back to that facilities master plan as a starting point of where we are, and then aligning that or comparing that to our data to make sure we're on target for moving forward. And then the district administrative team, again, we'll work with the superintendent and with the board to implement a process for implementation of those boundaries and begin planning forward for the following year to establish future meetings and timelines and to determine the scope of work for 15-16. What's the starting point and where do we begin for next year in terms of focusing on what boundaries we may need in relation to that projected student enrollment and the facilities, the capability of our facilities. Any questions on the timeline?
So I just want to make sure I understand. So on this boundary planning on top here, the initial phase, we're just talking about 46 and 47
It could also include a few other sites,
Okay.
because we do have some.
that have been identified previously?
Yes, in most
Okay.
cases.
Right, okay.
And just to follow up to that, so where would our demographic data that we have, or that I assume we would be getting in the middle of this process, how would that fit into this or impact this timeline?
We'll be receiving our demographic update before winter break each year, so we would plug it into the shell that was created last year with the steering committee with regard to capacity and utilization. So it would kind of be going concurrently.
Kind of like we did last year, that would enable us to kind of vet the final recommendation just as we get that data in, as we're finalizing the recommendations.
Okay, that's good. Other questions?
I
Mrs.
have one.
Oh, sorry, Mrs. Bailey, just a moment, Mrs. Thompson.
Why would we do feeder patterns without doing boundaries at the same time? I mean, we're talking a year. I can see 46 and 47 because those schools are coming up. But to me, are we wasting the public's time by doing feeder patterns without doing boundaries at the same time? It just doesn't seem fair or quick enough. From what I understand, feeder pattern, I never saw the document, but the steering committee did do feeder patterns, and I've never seen it. Why would we duplicate it? Why don't we take those feeder patterns that they drew, and those would be our options we would throw out to the community, and we can start that right in October. Does that make sense? You've got your feeder patterns that were done by the steering committee. Now it looks like we're going to throw that all out, start over. I would think it would be more efficient to take the stuff they've done already, make those into the options. Then you have your community dialogue meetings. And a good example is Fulton County does it this way. And they actually they're kind of interesting, but they divide their district into two. But that's how they do it. They come up, the admin comes in, they draw 5 or 6 options, they bring the community into a meeting, definitely the ones where it's impacting, and they just take the comments and the questions on each option. So the community has a chance to say, no, wait a minute, you're not thinking of this, because our community has a lot of history. They know what's happened as far as prior zoning has gone. And I think we need to hear them. And I really think, I don't know how everybody else feels on the board, I feel that we shouldn't throw the steering committee's work away and start all over. Now, I have not seen the boundary studies, but I think
Please be quiet.
I think that it's only fair that we go ahead and use their perfect feeder pattern that I've never seen Go ahead and put those into options. Let's go ahead and throw it out in October.
And that will
Okay,
be,
and then we get the feedback
Well, let
from
me
the
address
community.
that.
Well,
Well,
Okay,
but-
wait a minute, we let all the board talk
Okay,
first.
sorry.
Okay? Anyway, that's how I feel. And the other big elephant in the room is we can't do feeder patterns or anything until we deal with the academies.
Okay, I'm asking you to please be quiet.
This board met for one full day with the E-team. And correct me if I'm wrong, we said we want to tackle district-wide rezoning and the academies. And Jason, what did you say when we said that? You know,
Why do you put me on the spot like this?
because I remember exactly what you said. You said, we're strong enough to do it.
Yeah, we are strong enough. We've got the group to do it. We know that there's difficult decisions to be made, and I feel that we have the strength to do that, and I think we're ready to make those tough choices, so.
I don't feel like we should put the community in a holding pattern anymore.
Okay, so let's ask the administration to answer. What you're asking, Jenny, is steering committee did a lot of work. There's a feeder pattern option out there. And how do they see this all kind of fitting together? And how do they see the work that's already been done fitting into the process? So-
Well, and I would like the trustees to weigh in first before the admin weighs in first, because I know Ms. Tassan was on the steering committee. I know Mr. Dine was on the committee. Mr. George, were you? Okay, you were not. So, I mean, I think that they can definitely speak on what was going on in the steering committees, but I think we have to talk about it as a board, not
I did-
admin and Ms. Dr. Dupree.
Okay, and I definitely think that we should talk about it as a board. I'm just suggesting that we hear from them what their plans are for those things. Then I think we should just have a discussion about and react to it.
Okay, Ms. Martinez just told us her plan.
Correct, but we
Their
did.
plan.
Yes.
So we should hear from the trustees first, and then admin.
Yes, but she didn't get a chance to talk about the feeder pattern suggestions that had been made. And so let's ask her what, if that really exists, and what's going to happen to it. She did not mention it, and neither did Dr. Dupree when they were describing this timeline.
And that would be a good question, why they didn't mention it.
Okay, so let's ask them that right now, Mrs. Martinez or Dr. Dupree.
I'll actually address that. Mrs. Bailey, I actually think we are saying the same thing. Maybe I didn't speak clearly enough. Because I did mention early on in the presentation, our intent was to begin with the work that the steering committee did. That we want to begin. They did an excellent job on a proof of concept, if you will, and I think we even shared it with the board at one point, of what an ideal feeder pattern alignment would look like. The committee worked extensively on that, and we shared it very publicly, so absolutely, we agree. You and I are on the same page with that. We should begin with that. It would not be our intent to throw that out and start over again. Likewise, on the boundary planning, as you mentioned, we're again in agreement on that. My expectation is we would consider all of those things that are in the plan and consider what the priority would be. I think where you and I, maybe I haven't communicated again well, is the idea that we're all of the same mind. We want to move on this right away. And my takeaway, and this is where I really need the board's direction, my takeaway from the policy development sessions that we did was that we needed to do feeder patterns in tandem with boundaries, but we have to get our feeder patterns aligned before we can finalize boundaries. Because that's kind of the bigger picture, the feeder patterns, and then the boundaries. And then academies, now, academies were not part of the discussion tonight, but as I've shared with several trustees, we're working on academies. We're doing that right now with the intent that we bring forth a solution in the October-November timeframe. Because we're all in agreement, it's time to make decisions on all of these issues, and we support the board's desire to make that decision. But based on the way the policy is written, though, the academies will not necessarily, let me put it this way, we're considering the academies as an academic issue, not a boundary or feeder pattern issue. The board was very clear when they wrote the policy that we would not affect zoned students by having academies or any other academic programs in a place where it was impacting the zone students to that school. And we heard that clearly, and that's governing our work as we address the academies. But we're also doing that work in tandem with House Bill 5, because we want a well-articulated plan that's based on academic rationale, not just a logistical or structural rationale. And so we're working very hard and fast, but in the next 3 months, 2 months, we're going to bring all these things forward to the board.
Okay.
All right,
Let
let's
me
get some
just-
comments from some other people. Would that be all right?
Well, I'm just one thing. Again, I'm going to say the academies, because remember, neighborhoods got zoned out of a school because of an academy. All right? And that's just a whole other issue. But to get back, I just want to make one point about the PASA, because you asked about PASA. I did compare PASA's numbers with our actual enrollment, and they're pretty darn good. I mean, so I think we have good data to roll with. We don't have to wait for their final. They've done a really good job on those. So I just wanted to say that about PASA.
All right, that's great. Who has other comments? Mrs. Tossan, please.
Okay, so some of what Mrs. Bailey just addressed was on my little list of notes here. One of the things I want to say is that I agree that we need to start with what we have. I was on that committee. We were presented with a feeder pattern, at least proposal. Obviously, it was one. I think it would be great to start with that and maybe come up, I like the idea of coming up with a few proposals and maybe throwing them out there for the community. I'm of the opinion, and we looked at this a lot in the facilities steering committee, that if we don't address feeder patterns first, then that is going to directly impact zoning. So I feel like we need to look at feeder patterns before we can have meaningful zoning discussions. If we don't know which schools are going to feed into which middle school are going to feed into which high school, then it's going to be very hard for us to sit down and look and see how to draw those lines. So I am concerned, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, so this is just a concern that I feel like we can move pretty quickly on feeder patterns. It's not really rocket science. There are only really so many ways you can do it. We did some of that already. We have a really good foundation and starting point. I think if the board approves DeYoung and Richter to come back and help with some of that, they obviously already have the data and the experience and they know it. I believe they could pretty quickly help us come up with a couple of options that could be vetted by the community pretty quickly. That's just my opinion on that, having gone through that process. I think we could probably do that really quickly, and then we could start rolling on zoning, boundaries, that kind of thing, pretty quickly after that. So that's my comment on that. I would tend to agree with that. I think a lot of work was done. So, and I don't know if it was, I don't remember. I was at that meeting, but I don't remember if it was presented. But I have a really nice copy at my house I can bring and show everybody. So that shows that work that was done. And it was done pretty well, if I recall. I'm sure there are other options, but it was done pretty well because we looked at that data pretty hard. The other comment I would make is that I viewed academies as an academic issue as well, but I am also concerned that if we decide, I think how we decide to do that is going to directly impact zoning as well. It's going to directly impact utilization of a school, and it's obviously going to impact how we look at what students are going to attend what schools. We haven't discussed that. Like you said, it wasn't on the agenda tonight. We haven't really discussed how they're going to work together, but it may be worth discussing that and worth taking a closer look at how that's going to impact, line drawing when we draw lines. Now, obviously, we're going to start we're not going to do a district-wide study. We've already decided that that really can't be done effectively. But we can at least look at the facilities plan, the starting point that was there, obviously 46 and 47, and take a good look at what academies are in that area. Maybe that's a way to look at it, is to chunk it up. We talked a little bit about maybe moving away from planning areas and looking at what schools are being impacted, but if we look at that chunk of schools, I think it's pretty easy to see, what academies are there and how we're going to be impacting students in that area. So that would be one suggestion. My final comment or question is I want to make sure that I understand what is being proposed from a committee standpoint and community engagement. Because if I'm hearing you correctly, we went from the steering committee concept to more of a administrative type committee with community engagement. Okay. And I'm fine with that. I will say, having been on the committee, the thing that I liked about it was getting I liked the ideas being thrown out and being discussed. The community dialogue meetings, while they're called that, really didn't offer a lot of dialogue. It was more, here's what we're presenting to you, please fill out your form or fill out your online, and we'll just gather it that way. So there wasn't really a lot of dialogue. It was more of a presentation. So I would want to make sure that we do have the community engaged from an idea standpoint. I want the community to be able to dialogue with administration and really even with the board and let us know what their concerns are, why they have these concerns. Because we were able to do that as a steering committee. There were perspectives that I didn't have that people from other side of the district brought, and it helped us in that process, and I don't want to lose that part of it. One of the things I wanted to throw out just as a suggestion, as a board maybe we can consider, is if we don't have a big steering committee like we did last time, I think it might be worth maybe having an oversight committee of 3 to 5 people, or just some way to have representatives that can apply, that maybe represent that particular area, that could just somehow be given updates and then can update the community and maybe represent that area. I just would have some concern about losing that representation and people that are active and can throw out those ideas.
Well, there is actually one layer between kind of the dialogue meeting and the administration. If you, on the timeline you've been given, you can kind of see in November, it's got the district administrative team and local committee meetings. Part of the approach here is because the steering committee was very much based on a very district-wide approach. Whereas when you get into boundary drawing, that's definitely a more regionalized approach, where you might be drawing boundaries for one school, and it's going to impact schools immediately adjacent to that area. So we don't necessarily need a district-level committee to govern that regional work. But the intent is that's what Beth was describing. We would definitely, for example, see when we were doing Aliana, we would go certainly to Oakland, but any other school that we would kind of look at that map, any school that could be affected, we would engage a committee, as you've described, to come and study and give us good feedback.
Okay, so we
around
would
that.
still have committees.
Yes.
Okay, so
And
that's,
then we would do the
I'm
community
good with that.
dialogue as well, but we would have people working with us over a series of meetings to study, scrub, and help us frame what the boundaries should look like for that new school.
Okay, that helps, thank you, because I agree, I don't think we need the whole district to do these regions, but I do think we need that engagement.
Need people to know the idiosyncrasies of their
Yes.
neighborhoods and developments and so
Exactly.
forth, and so on. Thank you, Mrs.
Thank you.
Toussaint. Mr. Rosenthal, do you have comments?
Everybody's just waiting patiently.
Okay.
Been waiting long.
Mr. Rosen,
After we talked today, I thought a little more about the feeder pattern and how it can bring some closure to some of the academy issues. And I think the way I thought about it was you kind of look at the campuses without those academies, okay? Because we said in our policy, our programs, those are all movable. They don't belong to those schools, okay? And so if new feeder patterns evolve and put pressure, additional pressure on a school that makes sense, and that academy's sitting there, then that academy has to go. And so I look at it as an academic and a structural issue. I don't think you can just call it an academic issue. I really don't. Because what we've heard in the community, and one in specific, specifically, it's creating a lot of issues. And so I think that, and I think a lot of the issue, well, it's probably both academic and structural. I think the arguments that we've heard are both. So I don't think you can separate that. And, you know, I do think that it is a good idea to start with those feeder patterns. And it helps with what we heard earlier, you know, talking about the whole vertical alignment of curriculum. Well, when you know where those kids are coming from and that's consistent, then that helps these guys too. So, and then I do agree with what you're proposing here as far as having these small little local committees rather than a big steering committee, for some of the reasons we discussed, but.
Dave? Mr. Rice?
A number of good points have been brought up tonight, but I want to comment on some things that Ms. Tassan said. Namely, we do have a solid body of work that's already been prepared. And as long as the local groups, Dr. Dupree, have input, have a dialogue process so that they're engaged and they're not merely receiving a presentation from the administration, but that there is good constructive dialogue, two-way feedback, I think that's important.
Verdine, you have comments, or who's next?
I don't really have anything new to say. I was just going to say as well, I really like the local community groups. I think that's extremely important. And once again, I do agree with what the steering committee did come out with as far as the feeder patterns were concerned. I was involved in the process. I think that's a wonderful start. I don't have anything new to say, but just wanted to comment on that.
Okay, so what I kind of heard from everybody, see if I got this right, is that we would sort of like to see an accelerated feeder pattern conversation that maybe shrinks this timeline a little bit. We want to look at those feeder patterns through a clear lens without bias of programs that might exist on various campuses, but look at the capacity of those schools related to the schools they feed into, without consideration for maybe the programs that may exist at those places. And I also heard that we would like to make sure that the dialogue we value the dialogue from the local communities, from the local neighborhoods, and we want to make sure that that's real dialogue versus a sit and get environment where local communities hear things, but they have difficulty in expressing the idiosyncrasies of their neighborhood or situation back to the governing or the decision-making administrative committee. So I'd like to have it be real dialogue rather than presentation style environment. I think that's what I heard. And so, Dr. Dupree, we have a proposal that you gave to us, but as I understand it, that will need to be amended to some different amount, because what we'll actually, as a board, need to approve next week is a dollar amount to engage DeJong Richter for these community engagement services. Is that correct? And what would that look like?
Well, that's correct. Our goal for tonight was to, and you've given us exactly what we needed, and I appreciate the feedback. I think we're all thrilled to be at this point, and now we know what your expectations are. We'll work with Tracy during the next couple of days to wrap up the proposal, and when we release the agenda on Thursday, it'll have the final proposal with the dollar amount and everything included in that, hopefully for consideration next week so we can get moving on this work.
Okay, that sounds great. Do we have more comments? Mrs. Toussaint, did I forget something?
No, just another question. So if we're just looking at the timeline, is that something that we're going to get updated
Yes, we'll
on
update
Monday?
all of this.
Okay.
We'll actually do our best to have it out for you when we release the agenda on Thursday.
Okay,
if
good.
possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have one more comment on that. If you can be, maybe even set a separate row or something up for, specifically for elementary 46. Personally, I don't see 47 being that as difficult, but, and, because 46, there's some other considerations, that we have, that we can't really talk about, but, that are going on, possibly. And, those need to be considered. It's hard to do so in a kind of a public setting, So I guess, but that has a great impact on when and how we approach this. So, if we could put some thought into that. But I think that it would be good to have a separate line specifically for those, because those are coming up soon, and, those have to get worked out.
We can do that.
Mrs. Bailey?
I guess I just want to clarify, what in the world we're doing, so I kind of have a handle on it. 46 and 47, is that going to come to us in January for approval, the boundaries?
Yes, ma'am, that is the plan.
And that will be for when 46 opens and for when 47 opens, obviously. And I'm just going to use 2015-16 as a baseline here. So from what I understand, for the 2015-16 school year, we will only be taking action on 46 and 47 for boundaries.
Not necessarily. Early in the
Okay.
process, we could determine there might be a few other places we need to address. But before we go there, we will discuss that with the board and gain their insight and direction. Because we need to look at all of our current enrollment in comparison to what's, the capacity at our schools.
And I think I also heard that if we can accelerate this feeder pattern conversation, and if it can go on concurrently, and let's say it's a 3-year implementation or a 5-year implementation, some of those first-year implementations could happen in the 2015-2016 school year, if we're far enough along in the process.
That's correct.
Okay, so we could actually have, besides 46 and 47, be taking action on other boundary changes as well.
Right, but I also think we have said as a board that we want whatever changes we would make for the 2015-2016 school year, we want to have those decided in January so that appropriate planning can go on for those campuses for the upcoming school year. We don't want to be making those decisions in April and May and then have a lot of turmoil in planning for the campuses.
Okay, I guess as long as we make that clear to the community, because there were some recommendations in the steering committee that was made that I know those communities are going to be asking about. So I would just ask us to be very clear on when or if their recommendations are going to be, I guess, acted on.
So I'd say let's have the administration put together a new timeline with a new feeder pattern schedule, essentially. I think we're comfortable with the elementary school 46 and 47 schedule and plus whatever is in that zone, right? And let's see what that schedule looks like. Then we can talk about that next week to make sure we understand what would be this. Basically, we're talking about what's the scope of the work for this task. And so they can present to us what that scope is, and we can understand it, and the community can understand
One additional suggestion I might make is it may be worth circulating that document that Tracy gave us on the feeder patterns to the board so that the board can see what was already done.
That'd be really great, really, really great. Okay. Any more on this? Are we good?
No, ma'am, we're good on that. Thank you all for your direction.
Okay, excellent. So now we're ready for item 6B, which is the proposed schematic design for elementary school 46, or 47, sorry. And we're so glad to have Jennifer Henriksen from SHW Group to explain it all to us. Mr. Cleaver.
Yes, ma'am. Have Jennifer Hendrickson and Scott Klaus with now a Stantec.
Oh, right, I'm sorry.
He's actually going to stand.
Okay.
I'll talk loud.
And they're going
Yeah,
to be,
you'll
they'll
use
get
the
you a
microphone.
microphone. And they'll be talking about the schematic design for the Riverstone Elementary School, 1,200 student school in Riverstone. Please.
Thank you, Max. Madam President James, Board, and Dr. Dupree. Jennifer Henriksen, Principal in Charge at Stantec. With me is Scott Klaus, Early Designer, and over the audience is Gary Dunn, the Project Manager. We've been working closely with Dean Lanuke and Tom Cooper and Max and members of the curriculum team. We really got after it in August, and step one was to verify the program for the 1,200 student campus. All the other schools are around 850, so we had to update the ed spec. We did that work, and then we've been working through what we call schematic design. So we're going to present to you today our status point, and that schematic design is a site plan, floor plans, and basic 3D blocking and arrangement. So we want you to solicit your feedback on that layout. And I'm going to turn it over to Scott so he can go through our presentation.
Will do. Can you hear me okay?
I think there's an on button.
There's definitely a mute button.
Oh.
There we go.
Hopefully, the sound system's in the bond program.
All right, now can everyone hear me? Very good.
Perfect, thank you.
So we're going to start with a kind of a site analysis. This will just give you some idea of some of the forces that are coming on the site that are helping us to make some decisions about what the building looks like. This really is just about traffic and access. So our site is located in Riverstone. It is, can you hear me okay? No, I've got a lot of tools in my hand here. Our site is located in Riverstone. This is University Boulevard. That way it goes to Highway 6. This goes to 59, and this is the JT Parkway here. And our actual site is on Winding Water. As we get a little bit more zoomed into the site, we've got that primary drive in the neighborhood here, and then a secondary drive at that location. What we're trying to do in terms of site access is get the buses and the cars as far away from each other as possible. This is a 1,200 student school, and so it's 1.5 elementary schools, basically. And so we're going to have a lot of parents, and in this neighborhood, in particular, I think there's going to be a lot of walkers. There's going to be a lot of drop-offs, and so we're trying to do everything that we can with the site and real estate available to accommodate all those cars and all that traffic. These arrows here just are really indicating just sort of visibility to the site and where we want to have that front door visible for everyone who's coming to the school. This is actually a really important site, or important part of the site analysis. It really talks about solar orientation. It's important for a couple of reasons. One reason is just to improve our learning. We're trying to get daylight to all of the classrooms and to as much of the building as we can. And it's really important to kind of help the students in their learning. There's studies that have been done at the natural daylight, particularly on the north and the south. The more harsh light on the east and west, we try to minimize as much as possible. And then also just from an energy consumption standpoint, we're trying to make sure that we've got daylight into the buildings. The other part about this site, this is such a wonderful site. If you all get a chance to go drive by it, there's just enormous trees. It's a little bit odd shaped to try to place a building on, but the vegetation on this site is just wonderful. And one of the strategies we're trying to use for the building is to try to create as many views to that vegetation as we can, and along with that, trying to maintain as much as we can. This is a diagram of basically the organization of the site itself. Of course, the building will end up somewhere in the middle. We've got the two access points as far away from each other as we can get. We've got a parent drop-off more at the front door of the building, the bus drop-off and service along the west side, and then trying to preserve as much of this trees and open space for the children to use that area. This is a view of the site plan. Again, going back to that comment about trying to create as much queuing as we can, we actually have two drop-offs that we're proposing for the parents. We've got a main drop-off at the front door up here. We're showing some visitor parking off of that, but also I think we'll actually have an alternate price to get a little bit more parking. We're showing 150 spaces right now. That extra area there could add about another 20. And we're also showing a secondary parent drop-off here on the west side with sort of an entry courtyard, so that, again, trying to get as much queuing and as many of those cars off of the street as possible. The bus drop-off and extended day is down here in this portion of the site with service tucked in the back. This is a residential right now. There will be some future homes here. And there's a little bit of a park and some walkways across the way, and then this is drainage on each side. Also wanted to mention the area where the playground, we're trying to keep that in the back of the site, keep the kids safe. And this is just a future walking trail that we're showing. This something just almost like kind of like a master plan that we have here, just kind of showing that all the parts and pieces fit. As we get into the building, again, a lot of this is determined on just trying to get natural daylight into the building, and also trying to get the building to stack, and just a lot of different factors that we take into consideration. The general organization of the building is off of this main spine or main street. We have a main administration at the front door, and then we have a separate administration area on both levels on the other side of the building. Try to split that up because it is a larger building for the 1,200 students, so we're trying to get the administration spread out. We've got the classroom wings here that are stacked, so this is a two-story structure. We've got the kindergarten and first and second grade all on the first floor, so we've got all the small children on the first floor. On the second floor, we have third, fourth, and fifth, and an elevator centrally located so everybody can move around easily. The library is the heart of the school, so it's located right in the middle, right off of the main learning courtyard. And then the other thing that we're trying to achieve is be able to lock this school down at night and be able to access the gym and the dining and extended day and all those other functions that serve the building, to be able to shut this building off in one location and be able to use that at night. So I think that worked out pretty well with access to parking. As you go upstairs, again, all these wings stack, so it's very efficient from a structural standpoint. And we've got the art and music here. You'll notice all these gray areas are service areas, mechanical, so we're not trying to put any mechanical equipment on the roof. Everything is in the building, easily accessed. And as you walk along this second story corridor here, you get views out of the building into the vegetation and the trees, which I think is really just going to make this a very special place. We've prepared a couple of axonometrics just so that you all can get a better sense of the form of the building and kind of get a sense of what the spaces are like. You can see it's very nice and open as you walk through the middle of the school, but yet if we can also place doors and ways to actually shut the wings down if we need to, and then the students have a way to get out of each of the wings. As you move upstairs, you can see how the taller volumes start interacting with this main spine, and the relationship of the classrooms with the breakout spaces or flex spaces. And in a nutshell, that's an overview there. Questions?
Yes. How many square feet is the building?
It's 157,800. That's
Okay.
correct.
And is there a secure vestibule for the school so we can lock it down?
Yes, sir. So this works much like the rest of the schools Right there, you got that. So there's an entry lobby here with a reception desk. So we have a set of doors that come into that secure area, and then another set of doors that someone will have to pass through.
So that's where all visitors come?
That's correct.
Okay, but we have two parent drop-offs, so down there,
So there's a parent drop-off here with a sidewalk that brings
Yeah.
you to that door here, and then this main drop-off takes you to that door there. So you always kind of know where you're going. when you get- There may be a little bit of instruction that needs to happen.
Okay.
Some organization, but
okay. Do we know, what type of AC system are you planning?
Options, we're exploring multiple options.
Have the green light on, there you
Okay,
go.
thanks. We're exploring options. We had a building systems conversation internally with planning, construction, planning and design group, but we're looking, I believe it's chilled,
air-cooled.
air-cooled chiller system.
Air-cooled chillers? What kind of roof are you planning for that?
We're staying inside your, want to answer the question?
Yeah, I
We're
can.
staying inside the Fort Bend guidelines, but it'll probably be.
It can, and also Riverstone. So Riverstone, you have an option for a tile roof, which we're not really in our budget, and then we can also do a flat roof. Not a flat roof, sorry, a low-sloped roof. And so I think it's a single ply, or at least a membrane type roofing that'll have a reflective coating for LEED.
Okay. And are we going to have a monument sign so the front door is going to be easily identifiable?
It is.
Okay, for first responders and things like that. What type of water closets and urinals and labs are we going to put in?
We have not drilled, since we're in schematic design, Mr.
I mean, in
Russert.
terms of low flow or,
We're going to explore those so that we can, low flow, we're not looking at waterless at this point in time, but we are doing low flow to get our water efficiency credit points.
and with all the windows and orienting the school for views to the outside and also daylighting, are we going to explore a way to take advantage of that and maybe cut back some of the artificial lighting if we have enough daylighting in the classroom?
We'll be studying that through our energy modeling to see how much we can actually harvest, if you will. But that's why we're capturing the north and the south light, which is the good light, and shielding the east and west.
And
Okay.
I'll build on that just a little bit. We're actually transitioning into more LED lighting strategies because the prices of LED are coming down. And so actually the north and south light in combination with that help make it very efficient. So I guess what I'm saying is we'll explore looking at LEDs as well and getting pricing for that.
Okay, thank you.
We have other questions? Mrs. Tassan?
I didn't notice it on here, but are we going to have a separate drop-off area for the pre-K portion of the building?
Right now, we do not have a designated separate drop-off for pre-K. I think that would happen at the front door. The kindergarten and pre-K are right here by the front door.
The only reason I bring that up, so my kids go to the number 45 school. And one of the things that's really nice about it is that it has that separate area, because the lines do get so long for drop-off and pickup. And of course, pre-K is the half-day. So it's really nice to have that separate area, first of all, because they're the smaller children, and it cuts down on some of the chaos. And second of all, those parents that have to come early in the morning with the rest of everyone else can kind of go, and it's actually a kinder pre-K. So, because I see you have it together there, so that we actually get to go to a separate area. So just something maybe to think about that's
Okay.
nice. My other question, so I noticed we have music rooms downstairs and art rooms upstairs. So is that the plan, to keep it that way?
That is a great question, because there was a lot of dialogue about that.
Okay.
And so we went through a number of scenarios talking about, do we put the art and music together so that it's down there for the little tykes, and then have them also together so that there's not a lot of going up and down. But there's also the adjacency to the stage for the music, which is really, really nice, and the efficiency of having the two rooms together with a shared space in between. And so
Right.
there were a lot of different factors we took, and I think that these are labeled art and music, but they're very, I mean, there is a kiln, but they could be, at some point, you could decide to go
Versatile.
one up and one down, moving forward. I think there's some flexibility there.
Okay, so I guess so my point in bringing that up was that it'd probably be good to get some teacher feedback and maybe that's something they develop, as they see how it's gonna function with how the students go. Because my initial reaction as a parent was to think, well, maybe we want music and art downstairs and music and art upstairs, but then you bring up some valid points with the staging being downstairs. Maybe just something to think about.
Absolutely.
That's it. Thank you very much. Nice
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. George?
This is more like maybe a couple of comments, and I actually live in the area. I live in Riverstone. So one question I have is, like Ms. Tassin was saying, having maybe a third drop-off area for maybe small children. And I think, because from LJ Parkway, or if you come from University, the winding, what is that street called?
Winding Waters?
Winding Waters. That is a inside street. It is, if you really look at. So with a 1,200 children capacity, that can easily get so much clogged, and because I know the area, that's why also I'm saying that. That might be something I totally agree with Kristen, looking into maybe one more area where we can have small children dropped off or something of that nature. That might be a very good idea, because if you really look at, otherwise, it can be pretty, pretty chaotic,
Right.
So that's what I think, one thing. And just basic comments, and I see that I had a question about keeping the trees and stuff like that. I know that area, and I'm glad you're planning on doing that. It is beautiful. And another comment is sunlight. Its actual study shows, sunlight can make a big difference in mood and, being energized and things of that nature. You're considering and you're incorporating part of that. Your planning is, I think that is a wonderful idea. And also, how many acre this whole lot is? Just curiosity.
40 acres? 14 acres. So I was reading the lips over there.
40
Yeah, 40 acres.
14.6.
14.6, okay, 14.6, okay. Okay, yeah. I guess that are the comments I have, but I hope you seriously look into that transportation, maybe getting in and out of a little more, making it a little more easy, because it is a 1.5 elementary school.
And it's a wonderful comment, and we will go back and take a look at it. And, this is not only, 14 acres is relatively tight for the size of a building. And we're also trying to preserve trees, and we're also an awkwardly shaped site. And so there's a lot of different things that are going on, but I think we'll go back and take a look and see if there's another way we can.
And one last thing is, we have one exit and one entry. Is that part of the safety precaution we are doing, especially that front entry?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I'm just saying, see that, the front drop-off or that parking lot area.
This one here?
Yeah, is that part of safety?
Yes, you want
Yeah.
to funnel everyone to a central door so you can control access.
Okay.
That's the primary function. But we have the satellite administrative function at the other end. So if people come in, you have a control point there. But you can lock the doors, so all those doors around the building are exit only, so they can only come in the front door. That's the desire,
Okay,
and that's what we're planning around.
okay, beautiful.
Oh,
Yeah, I
around
was
here?
going to ask about that. So when it says parent drop off 100 cars, is that meaning that there's 100 cars can line up in that length
So
of
starting
space?
from here, this is double stack, so that cars can line up side by side, so it's a very wide driveway.
I see.
And they can, and that is to basically this point where they drop off, is where those cars stack up to. That's actually on the drive. And then this one also starts here, and then ends there. So that's 20 cars side by side stacked up. And I think what we're going to do, even in discussions we've had with the city this past week, is create 2 separate drives here so that the buses can come in without any issue, and that these cars can stack up, back down in that direction if they needed to.
Now-
This is a roundabout, I believe, down in here, so there may be a way to use the secondary access point for more stacking.
Yeah, I have one more comment there is, if you really look at the location of this school, there is a lot of houses are going to be within 2 kilometer, miles, distance. So the drop-off pickup number of parents doing is going to be much more higher than many other schools, if you really look at it. And
Absolutely.
so you might definitely keep that also in mind, just when you're planning. Thank you.
Thank you.
And did I catch there that you were talking about a separate bus entrance?
That's correct. We're going to split
Okay.
this into 2, just the way this was split up. We'll split it up into 2 different, so that we have a way for the buses to get in and out without having to mix with the other cars.
I think that sounds very wise, because they take a little bit of a wider turn, and if you've got cars doubling up to get in, then queue up, then I can see that would be a good suggestion, good addition. All right, do we have any other questions?
Just one more.
Yeah,
Are the portables drawn to size there? I just noticed that there's room for 3. Is
They
that
are,
it?
they're 64 by 24 or something like that. They are drawn to size. They're approximately the size of 2 classrooms. And you have to have this conversation. It sounds funny, it's a 1,200 student school, but you always have to make sure that you have everything covered. Not only do we have room for some there, but if you had to, you could even put 3 more down there.
All right, well, let's hope we don't get to that
I hope
point,
not.
Mr. Faust.
I have
We
to-
just have a policy we'd adopted about minimizing the use of those things.
No room for additions, though.
No, there's not,
Okay.
for a 1,200 student school. No.
Quick question, I guess, for Dr. Dupree. Are we really considering putting a pre-K program at this school?
I think it's
When
very
there's one-
likely it could be, because remember, pre-K is also related to language acquisition, so not just economic status, so it's very likely, that's a very diverse community, it's very likely we could need a pre-K for those
It's a
students.
high income.
But it's not income-based, it's language acquisition-based as well.
All right. I would just think there's other elementary schools that could use the pre-Ks first.
All right, any more comments or questions from the Stan Tech, for the Stan Tech team? Go ahead.
Just to let the
Mrs.
board know
Henderson.
that we're going to leave the images, those big boards here.
Thank you.
It's going to be here all week long if you want to look at them till next meeting. And you should have these copies, so if you have any questions, get them to Dr. Dupree, and he'll get to Max Tom, and we'll give you any answers you would like.
Great, and you mentioned one thing right at the beginning about changes to the ed specs.
Yes.
So those needed to be updated because of the size of
Student
the...
capacity.
Okay.
Because your educational specs or your program of requirements is
right,
based
right.
on 850 students. And
Okay.
this is a 1,200 student school, so we had to increase the classrooms. We had to look at extended day program because it's much larger. We looked at the flex spaces in the gymnasium, all the other food service, all the things that have to grow in proportion to the student population.
Okay, so good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the next item for us to review is the proposed construction manager at risk for elementary school 47.
Yes, ma'am. Speaking to y'all from page 8, back in July, the district issued RFQ 15001ML, and we received 6 responses for construction manager at risk for this school, for elementary 47. And we did a 2-step process again, where the first step, we evaluate based on qualifications, and then we shortlist the vendors. And then we asked for a list of, a short list. We asked for their fees and the money part of it. Upon evaluation, the three vendors that we asked to have submit their fees were Bartlett Cock, Brookstone, and Drymala Construction Company. And on page 9, 10, about 11, shows the bid tab for that. And at this point in time, we'd like to recommend Bartlett Cock. They came out on top with a score of 80.36, and we'd like to recommend them as the construction manager at risk for Elementary 47.
All right,
I have some questions.
Mr. Rice, please.
Mr. Cleaver, what is the value of the CMAR procurement process for Fort Bend ISD? Why are we using CMAR at risk, construction manager at risk, as opposed to CSP?
Yes, sir. I think in this market, when we're tightening up region-wide, I think that by using a CM at risk, we are able to leverage the relationships that they have with these vendors. Whereas when we do a CSP, we do not have the relationships with those vendors, and I believe that we can get better value out of a CM at risk than with a CSP.
So what are the pre-construction services that are going to be provided?
Pre-construction services, they will actually work with Jennifer and her team to, the main one is to, as the designer designs the building, to work with that designer for constructability. Architects can draw pretty pictures, but we want to make sure we can actually build it at a reasonable cost. So they work hand in hand with the vendor, with the architect, as we go forward to develop the construction documents, so that when it's time to bid, we know we have a set of drawings that can be bid and can be built at a reasonable price.
What's the construction budget for the school?
We're using the number that we landed on during the bond planning process, and I believe that was $187 per square foot. If you multiply that out by the 157,800 square feet, I come up with $29,508,600.
And what happens if during the pre-construction services, so are they going to be providing a cost estimate?
Yes, sir.
So what happens if we get to the end and we can't agree on the number? We can't agree on a number with Bartlett Cocker?
For the GMP?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'd have a couple of options. The first one I would hope would be that we could value engineer it and try to reduce the cost. Or we could, I wouldn't want to do this, but you could start over, which would not be the recommended way to go. So the first thing would be to add value engineer and figure out what components we could pull out and make.
But aren't they doing that throughout the process?
They will be doing that throughout the process.
I guess my question is, what happens if we reach an impasse? We have is it part of the contract to say we're going to pay you for your pre-construction services and start over with a different contractor?
Can you ask me that again, sir? I'm sorry.
What happens if, at the end of the day, we're unwilling to sign a contract with Bartlett Cock because we haven't been able to reach the construction budget that we feel comfortable with? Do we pay them the $15,000 for their pre-construction services and start over?
I will have to get back with you on that. I believe that would be the case, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
Okay.
Jim, real quick, what's CSP?
Competitive sealed proposal. So, yeah. So, Mr. Cleaver, at what point during the design process will you request a guaranteed maximum price from Bartlett Cock?
Well, we've had that conversation, and you can ask for it at any point in time. There's some thought out there that you ask for it when the design documents are done, at design development, when all the construction documents are done at the end of design development, or you can wait until after bid day, so that if you do it any time before bid day, it's just an educated guess. If you wait until after bid day, that's a real number.
So what is the at-risk for the general contractor in this regard? I mean, I've heard before that you would sometimes get a GMP at 60%.
You can.
CDs. But if we, and that's the at-risk part for the general contractor, if we wait until the construction documents are 100% complete, are they really at risk?
They would be at risk from the time that we agreed on that GMP to actually get the building delivered for that GMP, so they would be at risk there. Again, I have heard and, talked to people about doing GMP prior to bid day. I just don't see, how a contractor can do that. I mean, I know even with all the work ahead of them and doing the work ahead of time with the architect, it's still an educated guess until after bid day.
Many times, the construction manager at risk GMP contains a contractor contingency, and I'm assuming that we'll have an owner's contingency.
Yes, sir.
So who will decide what the general contractor can charge to the construction contingency versus the owner's contingency, and who's going to keep track of that?
Are you talking about, is your question, how much will those contingencies be?
No.
Okay.
I don't even know if there is one in the contract, but many times there is, and they're to cover things that might have otherwise been left out of the drawings. Of course, if we're going to wait till we have 100% CDs, we may not need to do that. But if we do, who decides? And in most cases, the general contractor would always want to use the owner's construction contingency instead of their own. So who decides what gets in and what gets out, and who's going to keep track of it?
Any type of work, it's always subject to owner's approval, and we will keep track of it through our AIA logs and our sheets and our pay applications.
Okay. Is there a provision for shared savings?
No, sir, all the savings accrues back to the district.
Okay, so there's no incentive for the GC to come up with any savings at all then?
Well, the incentive would be that they get the work, that they have the privilege of working for Fort Bend ISD.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Mrs. Bailey, do you have a question?
Yeah, I guess now I'm piggybacking off Mr. Rice. When do you think you're going to go out for the general contractor bid? I
Well,
guess what I'm, a timeline, when do we want to get this school going?
the school is to be delivered and open and ready by August of 2016. So what I'm hearing is probably a 14-month build. So just back plan from that. So here we go. Microphone,
You need to
please.
use a microphone.
Yeah, we have a timeline. I apologize, I don't have it with me.
Our timeline for the bidding phase, where the GC would actually solicit subcontractor proposals, is March and April. That procurement process is March and April of 2015. So right now, we're at the end of SD phase.
Mm-hmm.
And then from the 15th of September to the November 21st is what we call design development. That's our next phase. And then the contract documents is where we get down and dirty with really making the drawings for the subcontractors to build on. That's about a 3.25 month process that goes from November 17th to February 28th of next year. And then March and April is the procurement, and they basically have to put the drawings on the street for about a 4-week process. That's by law. And then there's time built in there to finesse and whittle down the number and make sure we have the correct subcontractors and make sure those are vetted clearly so that all the contract work is covered. And that we would be bringing to the board in April a GMP. Now, if you choose to move forward in that timeline and ask for a GMP earlier, that's a timeline you need to work out with the GC, but we as the architects would be part of that process too and work collaboratively to meet that timeline.
Okay, I guess the reason why I'm asking is, I don't know who to address my question to, but we've got one school that's closed to enrollment, 2 that are catching overflow. Is there any way we can, are you telling me we're kind of locked in time here? So we're looking at August 2016? for opening date?
Well, it would be hard pressed. I mean, anything's possible with money, because when you compress time, the cost of the project goes up. So we need 14 months to build the building. That's a given. And that's pretty tight. That's assuming that Mother Nature cooperates. And this is a virgin site, so we're not going to be uncovering any gas lines or things like that. So I think we'll be okay with, finding anything weird underneath the ground. So if you needed a starting time sooner, there's only a couple milestones that you can hit in a calendar year, either December or August. If you moved it forward, if we're planning August 2016, the next milestone forward would be December 2015. If you back up 14 months from that, we're basically today. And the drawings are not far enough along to even bid anything, and we're still collecting topographic information, geotechnical information, which is the basis for our design in terms of foundation and subgrade prep. So hitting December 2015 is not feasible unless we really compress the construction time, which is, they could work around the clock, things like that, but that would have added cost and things like that. So I think should have or could have maybe started sooner if we needed it now, but right now, August 2016 is, or 20, let me get my date right.
2016.
That's correct.
2016 is a realistic time frame.
Okay, so I guess I'm kind of with Mr. Rice here. I would hate for this not to go through, just because we've, what's going on with the overflow of students and just getting Commonwealth to being open enrollment again. It would be nice to have assurances on that. Does that make sense? I hope.
Assurances on it being completed in August?
Sure, I'd like it done by August 2016, if not sooner. But I guess I'm worried with Mr. Rice, if something falls apart and you have to go bid this again, it would delay opening the school. And that's what I would worry about.
Well, part of our selection and part of why we're bringing Bartlett Cock forward is we hope and we think that that's a bona fide offer and that's a bona fide contractor that can bring it. And that's why we would make that recommendation.
In the design phase, design development, that's where we, as the architect team, would work collaboratively with the GC to explore multiple options, our steel structure, whether it's tube structure or wide flange, which is the most economical, which can we get quicker. So we will be exploring all this. That's the benefit of CM at Risk, to explore different methods of materials. Roof types could be one that we could figure out. And if you get the CM, if you start to build that process with them early during the design, we could perhaps consider early release packages of certain things to help keep the cost down. But that's the benefit of the delivery method. And we're prepared to work with whomever you recommend. And we've worked with Bartlett Cock before and ready to do it again.
Yeah, my comments were more along the lines of making sure they do their job.
Sure.
You've got to make sure they do their job when they're providing the pre-construction services, to stay within the budget. And they need to know there's an incentive that if they can't stay within the budget, we have the option to terminate the contract.
Absolutely.
And put it out for CSP. So I know that CM at Risk is used a lot, but typically it's not used that well here.
Sure.
And I just want to make sure that we have some options, because isn't this the second project? Aren't they doing 46 too?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so they're pretty locked in to Fort Bend ISD, and I just want them to know that if they don't perform, we have the option to terminate the contract.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Max. All right, we're on agenda item 6D, which is Board Policy CW Local, which is the facility naming process. And this is an existing policy, and so we need to get board, do you have something you want to say about this? No. So we need to get board consensus that we're comfortable with this policy, or we need to make suggested changes to it so that we can approve this policy if there are any changes, or we can just suggest to the administration they go forward and implement this policy as it exists. So, do we have any comments? I'm on page 12 of our agenda.
Well, Madam President, I served on one naming committee for Bowie Middle School, and this is the same policy. I think it worked pretty well, and I would recommend that we continue with it.
All right, and I think right now we have, as our recommended trustee representative, Mr. Rosenthal is volunteered and been selected to serve on that committee this time around. So do we have any other comments on this policy? We're ready to go forward?
I know he'll do a great job.
I know you love meetings, Mr. Rice, but this, and there's a public meeting you can attend if you want to. Okay, so I think we're good with that. We don't need to approve that policy, or do we need to approve any direction for you for next week, or that's just?
Just, I guess just authorizing the superintendent to form the committee and go. So we'll reframe this for that language next week.
Okay. That sounds like a consent agenda item to me. All right. Moving on then, we've got the minutes. Oh, we're really moving on now. We've got the minutes, so if you have any questions on the minutes, you can send those straight to Mrs. Kaiser, because she loves it when we read the minutes and give her comments.
I did read them.
Awesome, Mrs. Bailey. Can you email your comments or corrections to Mrs. Kaiser?
I thought they were great.
Oh, she has no corrections. That's so fantastic. All right, so let's move on to item F, which is on page 53 of your board book. And that is these are the purchases, and Mrs. Leach is already at the table. This is fantastic. So number one is the books, ebooks, audiovisual media, and related items. Do we have questions on this one? I know we do. I'm sure we do.
Who wants to go first?
Mrs. Bailey, your
Wonderful.
microphone is on, please.
Go first. Okay, I guess I'm confused. Because the total amount is 12, you know what, I'm just going to have you explain.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my main point of confusion, because I was confused too, is the 6.7 million for proclamation 2015, the AP textbooks for 450,000, but then on the next page, we're talking about 9 million for the proclamation AP books, and that's where it didn't add up, so I just threw up my hands.
Well, let's back up just a little bit.
Okay,
This
thanks.
is a standard catalog bid for books, district-wide procurement of any kind of book, whether it's reference, library, materials, in our IMA books, our instructional materials allotment books. There is, of course, another proclamation coming up that you guys will address later in the school year. And so we'll need to allow for some procurement provisions in order to purchase those books. If you'll remember, and for the benefit of those who are new, the TEA has changed. Now they fund, and we actually have to procure. So we needed to have a method in place for that procurement pending the selection of that process. Also keep in mind the AP books are not funded. We do have some AP books that we need to purchase this year. We have AP books for next year, and on and on. The following school year, the proclamation has been canceled. So any books that we need to procure for the district, for the students that are textbooks, we're going to be pretty much on our own just to do replacements. There will not be an adoption in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. But by and large, this covers library books for new libraries, replacement books, reference books, anything that ends in book. So it is a large procurement. It is inclusive of all of these IMAs, but it's also inclusive of the library services budget and campus-wide budgets and department budgets.
All right. So don't get too hung up on the numbers, is that what you're saying?
No, but I
to
will
me?
go back and double check those because we looked at this so many times.
I understand. I looked at it a few times too.
Yeah.
Mrs. Tosan, you have a question because your light is on.
I do, I have questions. Okay, so number one, why aren't AP books funded?
I cannot address that question.
We know.
Perhaps you should write to your state
I
legislator.
would like to. I need to know why. I want to know why, how we're being
But
impacted
they
by
never
that.
have been.
Have
No,
they never
They've
been?
never been included.
I just don't understand that. Are we saying that AP is not valuable and we really don't need our kids taking AP classes?
We're not.
Okay. Is the
Not in
state
Fort Bend.
saying that?
Mr. Bassett
Have to.
has his light on, he has.
The only
Explanation.
speculation, because I've heard a conversation on this before, is the fact that if somebody is going through AP and they're successful with it, they're getting college credit for it, so maybe they should
Therefore, they
pay.
can pay for their own
Now,
book.
I mean, that's the only thing I can think of on that. I don't think there's an
We're
official
taking up a
stance.
collection for AP books. Please
And
donate.
it is optional. They're not required courses.
Oh, okay. Okay. Other question is, so how much are we getting in IMA funds this year? Because I kind of had the same confusion as Grail. It looked like it was listed for last year, but maybe not this year.
I don't have the amounts in front of me for what we get into the fund every year. It varies, okay, and it'll be different in the next legislative session. Right now, we have in the fund 6.6 million, and that's after recent purchases.
And
That's
that
what
number
we
is-
have.
A
available.
lot of recent purchases. We have 6.6 million in the fund now,
In
as
the
it
fund.
stands.
So are we covered? Is this part of our budget?
Yeah, we
Is
have
this
another
within the
5
budget?
million in our committed fund balance, okay? And what'll be interesting to see is what happens with the IMA in the next legislative session, because, I think decisions will be made on state funding that will affect our ability to cover these amounts.
I would hope so. Okay, so I guess that's my real question, is I wanted, it was a significant increase. I wanted to be sure we were covered in the budget. I wanted to see what the state was contributing. And I saw that Proclamation 2016 was canceled. So tell me practically, how does that impact us? I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Certainly, it puts us a year behind on all of the materials coming in. This happened, I want to say 8 years ago, there was a proclamation that was canceled. So then everything was delayed. So then the next proclamations that came forward were significantly larger and more massive
Which
in
means it's
size.
going to cause problems.
Right, and if I'm not mistaken, I have to go back and double check, but I think there were a few cuts in some of the fine arts and music books, drama books, things like that were delayed in the last cancellation of a proclamation. It has been some time since they've done this, and since they've restructured this process, this is the first cancellation of a proclamation that we've seen.
Right, so, and their basis for doing that was funding, wasn't it?
I don't know that they gave us a
Okay.
basis for that. I can go back and research and pull that, I'll pull that link for
Okay,
you.
I'm just trying to understand it all.
I know.
Thank
Me
you.
too.
All right, do we have any more questions on this? All right, so the next item is the temporary clerical staff. You have any questions about that? Windstream, telecommunications. You like it when the budget goes down? That's really great. Thank you, Mr. Pham and team. Any questions on that one? Microsoft Premier Support Services. Any questions on that one? Microsoft Enrollment for Education Solutions. Tell me if I'm going too fast. Any questions? Okay, Certica Solutions Data Validation Service. This sounded like something new.
It is, ma'am.
And it sounded really great. Can you give us a
What it is-
30-second
Yes, ma'am.
overview, please?
Sure. Certica is, or certified by Certica Solution, is a an application that will allow us to validate our data that we submit to the state, PEMS data. And it also allows us to efficiently monitor and also provide us with errors checking ability that we can send back to the campuses in a timely manner so that they can correct the errors. Allow us a whole lot more efficient way to submit PEMS data.
So it's like a check system that a person doesn't have to do, it's automated.
Yes, ma'am. And it also sends out reminders, constant reminders to all the campuses of the due dates and so on and so forth.
Could you give us a specific example of something like a,
What we have is like fatal errors of errors that have been input in there.
like if there's a
Different,
birth date that doesn't apply to a,
sure. Dr.
Dr. Hill, can you
Yeah.
give us an example, please?
I have example.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have
We just-
experience with this software several years.
Okay, give us just one
And
example of something.
One of the things that we do have fatal PEMS errors, and it pushes those out to the campus, and principals might not know that those are there without that report because they're spinning many plates. But this puts it on their dashboard, and also as an assistant superintendent, it pushed it on my dashboard. So if those things sat and I didn't see them being taken care of, I could send a reminder email. I'm noticing that on Monday, we had the same errors that we have on Friday. We probably
Give me
need to
an
look
ex-
at
Can you
that.
give us an example of an error? That's what we're trying to
Okay,
see.
one of the errors that I can recall showing up very early on was that we had inadvertently admitted a pre-kindergarten student who did not meet the age requirement. The state charges you every day that that student is there, that you collected money for the state, and that child didn't meet the age requirement. So the sooner you can catch that, the better. We also have 98s who are potential dropouts. At middle school, the kids will withdraw, they go off somewhere else, and we had that no one has sent for records. We don't know where they went. If we don't track those students down in a timely manner, then they become our dropouts. And this keeps those on the front burner.
All
So
right.
that's a couple of
Thank
three
you, that's-
examples.
That's great. All right. Any other questions? All right, thank you all very much. That looks like a great idea. Okay, next one, oh, that's all for you, Mrs. Leach. Thank you so much. Next is, wait a minute, it's a mass exodus of the curriculum department. I know, I think, there's 2 games of Monday Night Football on tonight, and it's the first week of the season. That could be why our attendance has dropped off radically. But I see Jonathan Frells over there, and we're not letting him leave till the very end. All right, let's keep going. We've got item G, 6G is budget amendments. Any questions? Mr. Bassett is eagerly awaiting our questions. No questions. Okay. Item H, the TEA class size waivers. So, Dr. Dupree, we saw that there are 18 schools listed, but we don't have a list of those classes yet. Is that still pretty accurate that we have, is that, 10 classes per school, or what do we have going on?
Well, actually, what we have right now, Dr. Hill is still working diligently on that, because right now we're not ready to share with the board in detail, because we're still hiring teachers and trying to get all the numbers as tight as we can before we bring the list to the board next week.
All right, and you,
But we just wanted to get this on your radar to know it is coming, and we'll provide more detail of which schools and which classes in Thursdays when we post the agenda.
okay, and good, well, we'll look forward to that, and I guess, I was just going to say that it's, as you know, it's a priority for us to have manageable classrooms for our teachers, and we know that the number of students in a classroom directly impacts their learning, and we want to have effective teaching happening in every classroom. So we know that you'll minimize the number of waivers that you need to bring
Well, what I
us.
would tell you is this morning when we looked at the list, we had 37 classrooms district-wide. only.
That's-
Last year at this time, it was well in excess of 100. It was 132 this time last year, and we're planning to bring that down even more before we seek your approval next week. Well, the other thing we're doing is we're also going to make commitments, because, as you know, it's important that we work with principals on this, because in some schools, they would rather operate with 23 or 24 students and bring in an aide. So much more earlier in the process this year, we're going to work with the principals to determine where we're just going to seek the waiver and hire an additional staff person to support the teacher, rather than break a class and put a sub, because it's not good for the children to be in it with a long-term sub in that environment either. So Phyllis has done an outstanding job with her team this year, that today we're at 37. We hope to be a little less than that when we seek your approval next week.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing that.
Can I just make a comment that's not directly related, but since you're talking about
Don't make eye
teacher-
contact with
teacher
Mr.
hires,
Morris.
teacher hires and whatnot, I think you all have done a really good job, at least in my narrow experience in my own family. I know my son was telling me about his math teacher who knows those Inspire calculators inside and out. She's got 15 years of experience. You just brought her on. And then another one in...
He searched the whole state, the
another-
whole country probably for people
Another-
to teach your
another
kid math
teacher
with an
in-
Inspire
in-
calculator.
We also carefully assigned to your children.
Anyway, there was another...
I had
another
other
one at
comments
the-
about the Inspires
Another one
from my
at-
kids.
Another one at the high school level that's top-notch, a lot of experience, so good job.
All right, well, that's great. Keep up the good work, all you hiring people.
That would be HR.
I know. I'm looking right at him. All right, I'm going to just keep pushing us through here because we're on a memorandum of understanding. A memorandum of understanding for ESL classes at Ridgemont Early Childhood Center, which is a great program. Do we have any questions about that? All right, the next item is item J, which is a student coalition to Foshan, China. That is a partnership, I believe, with the county judge, has a kind of a partnership, global, sorry, I was getting there, global initiative, global partnership with, and so I guess this is part of it, some of our kids get a chance to travel. Do we have any questions about that or comments, Mr. George?
I believe, our children, if everyone we can send outside of United States, that is, I believe that is one of the best things we can ever do for them, but practically that's not possible. And this initiative, and I'd like to know more about, what, how you select, of course, they're talking about selecting children from the leadership program and what they're going to be learning and how long they're spending time there and what is their expectations. And as a comment I wanted to make, that is absolutely a wonderful, wonderful thing we can do for our children. So I could almost guarantee that they come back as totally different people, when they travel overseas. So I like to know more about it. Maybe this is the time to explain, get into the details.
Well, maybe they could write something up or something and send it. You already did? Is that what you're saying to me? There was a memo that was a little bit of information, so.
We're in the process of developing the application. We'll be working with Lamar Consolidated so that it is one application. It will be screened by those in Foshan, China, so that it'll have kind of an impartial look to that selection process. Other than that, as of today, probably don't have any more information, but we will within the next few weeks, and certainly we'll be passing that along, other than what's already written here. But it's an exciting, very exciting opportunity for our kids. Very much looking forward to it.
I totally agree with that.
Yes, to what we can do, and working beside Allison Nguyen, and then also Lamar Consolidated. So a lot to explore.
My question is actually, if we partner with maybe local businesses and, this involve a lot of money too, so maybe we can increase, the number of children participating in this kind of programs, Again, you're starting something new and I understand, but I like to see something like this. It's very exciting for me also.
And maybe
Thank
some
you.
long-term relationships can develop in terms of,
Absolutely.
satellite learning and communication and whatever too, so that's kind of an interesting idea.
And do you know how long they're going to be spending? time there?
Approximately 2 weeks.
2 weeks, okay.
Thank you, Mr. George. Do we have any other questions? All right. Moving on then to the next thing, which is the PDOS appraisers. We have a list there of those. There might be more for next week, would there be, or we're sticking with that list?
3 possibly, if we get their, 3 possibly if we get their certification information, and then there's 8 more that'll be attending training either this or next week, next month.
All right, and Mr. Spears, then, do we have then our administrators, what kind of percentage of our administrators would be PDOS approved or certified?
By probably about 95%.
All right. Okay, any questions on that? The next thing is the interlocal agreement with Region 4 ES, or Education Service Center, for criminal history background checks. Any questions on that? Mr.
I have one
Burdine?
question. The employees at the after-school programs, do they have to go through this process, or? They do. Thank you.
So, one question.
And-
So that means anyone who employ, volunteer, anything to do with the school system, they have to be background checked?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it.
Not only that, once they volunteer, they're in the system. So if, let's say they get something on their report, we get an instant message saying that, hey, you have this employee volunteer, something just came up on the report, and then we investigate it.
Current policy is every year they have to renew also, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
With
So
our
we are-
vol- with
we are
our
going-
volunteers.
Right, we are going to
Yes.
continue that also.
Yes.
Yeah, things can happen in between, 12 months,
Things can happen.
That is true.
Exactly, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rice, or do you have a question, or you just have your green light on in case?
I'm preparing to make a report to you.
Okay, well, we have a few
So
more
I'm
items. so
at the
don't
ready.
Don't jump the gun. I'm so glad, because I don't want you to miss it. I might just ramble right through it. All right, we're on item M, the approval of the tax roll and the certified values for 2014. Do we have questions about it? All right, very well. Then the next is the proposed tax rate for the 2014 tax year, which is the same as last year. Any questions about that? Okay. The next thing is the resolution regarding a walking trail and playground equipment at Walker Station Elementary, and I believe this is a resolution with the 2 different MUDs. I'm not on that page because I'm going so fast I can't keep up with myself. Is that right? It's with 2 different MUDs?
That's correct.
Yes, ma'am.
Somebody help me out. That's called a lifeline. Asking for it.
That's what I said, yes, ma'am.
Okay, 2 different MUDs and the PTO, subject to legal review. Any questions? All right. Then the last thing on the list here is the board operating procedures. And I brought this last time because we have, what's that? I know, you want to table it, but I'm not going to let you. I'm just going to keep talking. I'm not even going to give you a chance. So I brought this last time because in section 6, the way it is written right now, we have an actual time listed for the people to turn in their request to address the board. And over the summer, we changed the starting times of the meeting. We didn't change the starting times of the meetings, but we had a little bit of variability in the order of events at the meetings and tried to move the audience time. And because we were limited at that 6:45 time, we had some trouble with, we had to move items around in the agenda, I guess, while we waited for 6:45 to arrive. So that was kind of the reasoning behind that suggestion. And then the second suggested change in Part C there was the public, and we can have a conversation about this, the public comment after these agenda review workshops. People were having to turn their forms in at the very beginning, and then if there was only one or two, the idea was that we would ask for additional people to make comments to fill up the 15 minutes that we'd allotted for that. So that's just an effort to try to have the opportunity for more people to be able to address us after they've heard us discuss about the different issues. So do we have any conversation about that or suggestions? We're good with that. Okay, so great. Thank you for that. Thank you for listening to me. I feel so much better now. See, we could have done this last month. It wouldn't have been that bad. But that's all right. All right, next, Mr. Rice, we're ready for an audit committee report. And as chairman of the audit committee, could you please give the report?
Yes, thank you. The audit committee activities prior to the May 2014 board election consisted of selecting 3 different auditing groups to provide financial and operational audits when needed. Those were the TASB Gibson Consulting Group, McConnell & Jones LLP, Weaver and Tidwell LLP, and following the May board election and the election of officers, President Grell James invited the following board members to serve on the board audit committee. Herself, Mrs. Kristen Tassan, and me. Once that committee was constituted, a meeting was held with Greg Gibson of Gibson Consulting to review their previously prepared audit risk assessment report they prepared in 2013 so that we could plan for the 2014-15 audit year. The audit committee determined the following audits would be addressed first. One is an audit of the purchasing and accounts receivable for the 2013-2014 year. Second is a preemptive audit of construction management. Third is payroll for the 2013-14 year. And fourth is the student information system follow-up audit to evaluate the district's effectiveness in implementing recommendations from the spring 2014 audit report. TASB Gibson has submitted a proposal late last week, which will be reviewed by the audit committee this week, and we'll make a recommendation to the full board of trustees for approval at the board meeting on next Monday, September 15th, 2014. So if approved, these audits will be completed as follows. The purchasing and accounts receivable audit will commence in October and be complete in January of 2015. The preemptive audit of construction management would begin in October and complete January 2015. The payroll audit would commence in February of 2015 and be complete that April, and the student information follow-up audit would commence in February and be complete in March of 2015. In addition to those activities, the audit committee is continuing to interview candidates for the position of internal auditor we hope to have this position filled within the next several months. That concludes my report. I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Anybody have questions? Mrs. Bailey?
I just want to thank Mr. Rice, Ms. Tassan, and Ms. James for serving on this committee. It's gone through many good changes, and I really like the areas you all chose to focus on. I thought that was really good, so thank you.
Thank you.
Great, so we're going to need, for our meeting, some information about the budget that we have available so that we can be sure we're all in alignment with that. So I guess we'll figure out when we're going to meet, and it's going to be in the next couple of days.
Thursday.
Thursday. Okay, I better check my email. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Rice. Next is audience items. We have one speaker. What's that? We have one speaker, and it's Mrs. Tammy Marino. No, you only get 3 minutes. But you can send me a really long email if you want to. I know you will. I appreciate that about you. So you have 3 minutes. Mrs. Bailey will time you. And those of you who stuck around today, next month, hopefully, you'll be able to jump in with the fun.
This can all be yours.
And participate too.
I
Because we
won't.
love hearing from the community. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you.
That's
Mrs.
okay.
Bailey, are you ready? All right, go ahead.
I won't even take up the 3 minutes, I promise. So usually at board meetings, as of late, I get up here and I thank Dr. Dupree for calming all of my tension and stress. And tonight I would like to thank the board. Ms. Bailey and Ms. Tassan, you both did, I always pronounce your last name wrong. You both did phenomenal in representing the needs of the community and showcasing that when there is no need to wait, we shouldn't have to wait any longer, and stressing the importance of using what the steering committee came up with and working from there. And I understand, Dr. Dupree, that that's sort of where you were headed also, but I think they really kind of hammered it in hard and drove the message home, and I could not appreciate that more. And I hope the entire community is listening, and they'll certainly hear from me that all happened. So I appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the amended timeline. And just for whoever's interested, after the meeting, I do have that feeder plan, and it's very well worn because I look at it every day. It actually hangs in a frame over my fireplace. I'm looking forward to the changes. I think you're all just doing a really bang-up job of a very enormous and painstaking undertaking, and I appreciate you all, so thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Marino. Thank you for coming tonight. All right. Next is our bond communication discussion. And I do not know who is leading it, but it is not me.
Well, we've got 2 attorneys in the house. Well, they're coming, Jonathan Frells and Rick
Well,
Morris.
we have more attorneys in the House than that, I know, but
Well, I
only
mean, to guide our discussion.
two of them are, okay, thanks.
But everyone each of the board members should have a handout that we've been working on diligently. I will tell you there, just before you look at it, there are a couple of typos in it still. Some dates are wrong, especially in relationship to when some of our schools will open. So as you read that, just know we're still refining and fixing some of these things. But Mrs. James had mentioned that she would like for the board to have this in context of the discussion for this evening. Rick and Jonathan are prepared to kind of address some very direct and practical issues related to the board's role and the staff's role and how we communicate about the bond. And as you know, open house in our districts begins tomorrow night. And so we're going to begin distributing this document and having public meetings at each of our open houses tomorrow evening at the high schools. So it's timely for you all to hear this and for us to hear this. So I'm going to turn it over to them to kind of discuss with the board where we're going.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. You all have received, I believe, a PowerPoint presentation that generally spoke to some of the communications laws that govern the school district generally. And I will tell you that there is one basic principle that you need to keep in mind, and that is that the district is prohibited from using district resources for the purpose of advocacy. And so the administration is familiar with the constraints in that it can only communicate factual information and not engage in advocacy. But we realize after speaking with Ms. James that we probably weren't giving you enough real-world context to how the board can be affected by that constraint. So you as board members, while you have the right as individual citizens to advocate in support of the bond, you cannot command the district resources yourself in communicating in a way that would constitute advocacy. And so Jonathan and I are here tonight to talk to you about some particular contexts that you might actually encounter as board members, where we want to give you some guidelines that you can engage in advocacy, but we want to show or talk to you about some areas where you might unwittingly find yourself using district resources when advocating, and then that poses a problem. So, you know, sitting to my left here is very capable bond counsel, and this is really his primary area of expertise, but he and I have visited in advance of tonight's meeting, and so I'm going to bring up some what we think are some real-world situations that you'll encounter. We'll talk about each of those, and then should any of you have any questions after that, we'll certainly do our best to answer those.
Mr. Morris, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Sure.
I think that the PowerPoint you were referring to is this one, and I'm actually not sure that the entire board has this.
Okay.
I know you gave me a copy, and I reviewed it prior to our conversation, but Mrs. Bailey's looking at me funny.
I don't have it.
Okay, so we do not have this, so perhaps we can get it in our communications soon.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Well, no, I'm glad you gave me that clarification, and I apologize. I thought it had been provided to you all at the last board meeting. So, did anybody have any questions about the general principle that district resources cannot be used for advocacy? I mean, I think that's plain enough. The question is, what can you do as board members? If a district employee engages in any form of advocacy, they are inherently using a district resource because they're paid a salary. You, in voluntary service, you don't run afoul of that if you generally speak in favor of the bond. But if you were at a school-sponsored event, then arguably you are commanding district resources by advocating that message in a forum in which the district is paid for that forum. So even in those circumstances, we err on the side of caution and we tell you not to do that. Formal gatherings, though, if you're in attendance at Rotary, Chamber of Commerce, you're asked to comment officially about your position regarding the bond, you're free to do that. Okay? Casual conversations that you will likely encounter. People ask you, are you in support of the bond? You are certainly free to share with them your opinion about whether you support the bond or not. Social media, you're likewise free to communicate on social media, provided it's your social media, and you're not piggybacking on the use of some district resource when you're communicating that message. The only caveat that I would share regarding that is, of course, you know, you have to be consistent in your messaging as board members in terms of communicating what you've agreed to do as a body of the whole. And so I think that that's what's valuable and important about the brochure that Dr. Dupree's been working on that has a wealth of information, because in essence, I think if you you stay with that script, you've got the talking points you need to at least communicate information that is of some factual value to your constituencies. Email communications is an example where you can unwittingly have a problem. You all have district email accounts. To the extent that you are using your district email account to advocate in support of the bond, that's arguably a circumstance where a district resource has been provided to you, and you should not be using that for advocacy. Your personal email accounts, of course, are not a problem. Formal pieces, letters to the editor, things like that, again, if you're writing it on your own time, you're free to do that because you're not commanding a district resource, although I think we've talked about this before, to make sure that you all are on the same page and you feel comfortable that your singular message is being communicated the way you collectively has decided you'd like it to be communicated. I think if it's a formal communication that's meant to be representative of the board, then that should be funneled through your board president. And then speaking to requesting, all related to this, you all certainly may have questions about information that you need from the administration. And there's nothing wrong with you, no different than any member of your public who comes to the administration building and asks for information. You're entitled to the same information. What you can't do, though, is you cannot direct district employees or staff to compile information for the purpose of advocacy, because then again, you would be enlisting a district resource in order to communicate a message of advocacy. But of course, if there's information already prepared, and we know that the administration has been working hard to gather factual information, you're equally entitled to the same information just as any other member of the public would be. In fact, of course, because of your duty as board members, you actually arguably have greater entitlement to receive the information. So those are some of my general thoughts regarding some typical areas where you might be called upon to provide communication. But I'll turn it over to Jonathan to see if he has any additional thoughts that he might want to add.
No, thank you. I think you covered things very well. A couple of other things that I would just add is that the Ethics Commission has looked at use of district resources fairly broadly, and so I just want to make sure you're aware of that. If you use a district iPad in order to send out the information, you're using district resources in order to do that. The kind of classic far end of the spectrum case in which the Ethics Commission actually found that there had been a use of district resources was when a board member handed a flyer to a secretary at a school district and asked her to put the flyers in the cubbies for the teachers so that they could see them. It was a flyer that the board member had personally produced and everything else, but the use of the district's internal mail system and the time of the secretary to hand that out during school hours was found to be a use of district resources. So I say that just to caution you on that. As Rick said, when you are on your own time using your own resources, you are a private citizen and you have the right to advocate. But just keep in mind where that line is on using resources. The other thing that I would add that I think is important is that if you are in a board meeting and there are posted agenda items to talk about issues related to the bond election or reports or such that are posted, you can be free to talk openly about your position on those types of issues. But just make sure that it's during a posted session when you have the opportunity to do that, because you have the kind of interplay of both the ethics rules and also the Open Meetings Act that you're dealing with.
So I have a question.
Go. Are we ready for questions? Okay, Mrs. Tassan, please.
So I'm envisioning a scenario where we're at, let's say, an open house that's happening this week where we're discussing the bond. If we are in attendance and we get questions from the public, not standing up and speaking, but we just get questions privately in conversations, I want to be sure that we understand what it is we can and cannot say, because obviously we approve the bond proposal and we have opinions about it and we have information related to it. So what are the parameters in those private conversations when constituents and community members come up and ask us specific questions?
Well, so my view regarding that is if you have a scheduled allotted time in the open house to make a presentation, you're really commanding part of the resources that the district offers, because that's an open house and it's scheduled to be open for a particular purpose. If you are incidentally sharing information in response to inquiries from people who are in attendance at the open house, I don't think that runs afoul of the efficacy or the advocacy prohibitions, but you may have a...
No, I would agree with that. One thing that you can do if you want to just create a little bit more distance there is just to say, look, I'm talking to you as a parent and a community member here about this, and these are my real feelings on those kind of issues. It's not required to say that. But again, I think sometimes it can be helpful just to draw that line a little bit more clearly. But I agree with what Rick said.
My only other question is, will we be getting electronic copies of these types of things? Is this something that we want to be distributing for informational purposes to anyone because I can envision us to getting a lot of those questions and us saying, well, we have this nice little brochure you can look at that gives you all that information.
Yes, we'll be handing this out at all the open houses this week and next, but it'll be posted online as well.
Oh, good.
Provided to the board electronically.
Very pretty.
And the link to the place on the website, where it is. I know you'll give us that.
One last question and I may have asked you this before, but what about those of us that may have personal websites or websites that we've used for informational purposes as trustees? Can we put information out there? I know we can link directly to the Fort Bend website, but what kind of information can we post on that type of website?
Well, certainly you can provide any factual information you'd like, as well as advocacy provided. And I would assume that your personal websites are completely funded and owned by you and that they're unrelated to the district. I think many of you also, to the extent that you have websites, have disclaimers on them that you're speaking only on behalf of yourself, you're not speaking on behalf of the board, and I think that further clarifies the point that Jonathan was making, that you're basically engaged in advocacy as a private citizen at that point.
All right, and maybe just as you could resend us that disclaimer in case we don't have it posted, then if we could, or if we have a website that's recently gone live. Mr. George has a question?
Yeah, it's more like a comment maybe. At this point, I don't know anybody's going to ask what is your position on it because we all voted on it. So why you voted for it or what do you think about further? That could be the question, and it is coming up on a regular basis. So let me clear about, you're saying we would be able to send out district-created materials like this from, can it be sent out from an iPad or provided by the
And
district?
one thing I would point out, anything that's district created is going to be informational only. And so the district is in the process, and as they're preparing these, they vet them very closely to ensure that they're solely informational in purpose. So anything that's kind of linked on the district's website, you could provide. The one caution I would give you is that if you give it a little spin and all of a sudden it switches from informational to advocacy, that's where you need to be careful. So it's kind of like in the cover email to the link or different things along those lines. That's where you can kind of run afoul by saying, even anything that would promote the passage of the proposition would be considered advocacy. So that's the one caution I would give you on that.
And so to build on that, just how easy you could make that mistake. Jonathan made the point that you could be using your district-issued iPad, and you could be forwarding a copy of the brochure, and all you might say in your email forwarding it is, attached are the reasons why I support the bond. Well, okay, now you've engaged in that one sentence with advocacy on a district-issued iPad. So the point is, if you're only forwarding the factual information that's been provided by the district, Jonathan's right, you can forward that from your district email, you can forward that from your district-issued iPad, because it's just factual information. But if you move beyond that to advocate, then you have to be scrupulous in ensuring that that's coming from only your private computer and only your private email, or if you make copies of it, you only use your personal copy or at least a non-district copy.
And if you're moving quickly through something and trying to get it out, it is real easy to cross that line without ever thinking about it. And because you may look at it and send it one moment and then think about it an hour later and look back at it and say, oh, wow, that was a little bit more than I intended to say.
I just wanted to add there, I'm not a fan of sending out emails to begin with, okay? Because I know I could make mistakes. So I always, even when people send us long emails, I always say that, this is my number, call me. So, or things of that nature. So, but I just wanted to clarify,
Great point.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, and thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions? Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thanks for being here tonight. I think that concludes our business, so do we have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
We have a motion to adjourn and a second by Mr. Rice and a second by Mrs. Tossan, and it's before 10 o'clock. All those in favor, say aye.
Barely.
So, did the other one